It's kind of interesting because I thought a lot about it in preparation for this meeting, but I think if I go back to when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I was reading some what are referred to as young adult novels, which the focus that I was reading in was manufacturing companies in the United States that sponsored team sports, especially basketball. Now, I played a lot of basketball when I was growing up, and so inevitably in each of these books, there was a person who joined the team who is known as a troubleshooter, which today we would call a management consultant. And I thought that would be a pretty cool job to have, to be a troubleshooter. So that kind of sat in the background in my unconscious and guided me through a lot of what I was doing. Then my first jobs were in sales, so I got fairly well skilled at that. And actually, I'll tell you a funny story. I started selling when I was about 6 years old. And I was at a day camp that was on 20 acres of land and had 2 water fountains. So I convinced my mom to buy me this little plastic canteen so I could carry water around.
Wow.
And then the bigger kids started, or I should say the older kids, they weren't necessarily bigger than me, started pestering me for water. So I said, okay, a nickel a swallow. And they would show me how stupid I was and drain the canteen. And of course I would go and refill it up, and I got lots of business. So that went on for about 2 days, and the third day I got my first rejection. The camp counselor came and confiscated my canteen and said what I was doing was wrong and bad. And when my mom came to pick me up, he told her, don't ever let him bring this back again.
At 6 years old.
At 6 years old, yeah. The only thing I hadn't figured out was packaging and distribution. I mean, we all drink bottled water today, right?
Yep.
So I was just a few years ahead of my time. So I was doing that, and at the same time as continuing my education. I have a master's degree in finance, and I have a doctorate in education. Actually, it's from Pepperdine University. It's a School of Education Psychology. So I have a lot of psychology and a lot of education courses. And I got into the management consulting area finally about 1985, even though I'd done a lot of development work before that. And unknowing, what I was really doing was teaching people how to move past knowledge into wisdom. But I didn't know that at the time, because I was still working my own self. So in that process, I slowly began to develop that whole concept, because you can't really teach wisdom, but you can help people through the process of learning to be wise. And so I was putting together the mechanisms to do that. In about 2010, another friend of mine and I created a university in New Mexico called Insight University, and we offered a doctorate degree in transformational leadership. And that went on for about 5 years. And then the U.S. government changed all of the regulations about how a university could operate. And our cost to run the university went from about, $10,000 a year to about $3 million a year. And I just didn't have the pocket change to continue it. So we stopped it, but we did graduate 2 classes. So that was very nice. And I continued to learn more about, okay, how do we teach people the process of learning to be wise? In the meantime, I had developed a couple of programs that we refer to as People Savvy, which is the name of the company, which taught fundamental people skills to salespeople and leaders. And then essentially, how do you build a relationship with the person that you're working with, or how do you build a relationship with a client? Because most sales today are more service-oriented than pounding products. And you really have to look at the client as a long-term, not a short-term transaction. So it's really become long-term. Again, that's another element of wisdom. the thing that I learned most about wisdom is each person has their own unique process and has their own unique understanding of what's wise for them. And so if you try to give them something canned and structured, it just doesn't work. So a lot of the wisdom development process is helping people learn to ask questions and ask questions of themselves so they become more aware. Aware of not only what they're doing, but aware of all the stuff behind it. So if we look at wisdom built mostly on experiences, there's two kinds of experiences. There's the subjective experience and the objective experience. So let me explain a little bit about that. The objective experience would be like all of us know how to drive a car. And so we climb the car, we drive it, and a lot of times we just go on autopilot. And we realize we've been on autopilot when we miss our turnoff from the highway. So what we don't really pay attention to is the subjective experience. And that's all the emotions and thoughts and imagination that we have when we're driving. So, and each of us will have our own subjective experience. So if somebody cuts you off, slams in front of you, some people will just take that and not be concerned about it. Other people get very angry and lean on their horn. Some people will just not understand what's going on and try to get off the road because it's just not comfortable. So that's subjective experience. Where wisdom really comes in is asking questions to understand your own subjective experience to develop your awareness about yourself. Because wisdom is always self-motivated. It's not an external thing. Even though we sometimes define wisdom as something external. So that's part of the process. So we have that. So really, the next piece to understanding our experiences and becoming self-aware is what I call depth of understanding. And that's where we really begin to not interrogate, but begin to question ourselves. So it's a self-introspection process. The only problem is most people do a self-inquisition process where we yell at ourselves and we get mad at ourselves, and all that does is tie us in, to block us. So we have multiple dimensions of awareness that we develop. So we'll be aware of what's going on with our physical body, and we'll be aware of what's in our imagination. We'll be aware of what's in our emotions, and emotional intelligence is a huge thing right now worldwide. We'll be aware of our mental processes. The hardest one is being aware of what all the unconscious processes are, because if you go directly try to ascertain that information, you will go unconscious. You'll fall asleep. So the best way to get the unconscious process is just through a process of contemplation, where you just allow that to emerge from the inside of you so you can see it more clearly. The real challenge people have with this developing self-awareness is these things tag together. So you might have a mental thought process, but underneath is an emotional process and an imagination process. So as you start to look at the emotional process underneath that, there's imagination process. So these things begin to tie together. You all know what the Gordian knot is?
No.
If you look at ancient mythology, there was a king who wanted to marry off his daughter. So he built this very complex knot on a bridge. And if a person could unravel the knot, they would get the daughter's hand in marriage. So Alexander, who I'm sure you're familiar with, came along, lifted the knot, drew a sword, and just cut it in half. So, the way to cut things in half is through deep introspection and, if you will, spiritual exercises. And that is meditation, contemplation, all prayer, all those kind of things, because that's the thing that holds steady when all the other stuff is moving around outside of you. So when we talk about wisdom, we're also talking about what's called a transcendent experience, where you literally transcend all of these other levels of consciousness. And to do that, you need to understand how your head, your hunch, and your heart is working to either support you into that or running against you. I have a friend of mine that says, yeah, I've really gotten smart with my mental process. I continue to say, I wish my mind would just shut up. So I don't know if you've had that experience, but I certainly have. It's like, it's kind of like monkeys chattering constantly, So, this is part of the process, is learning to go through that. My job as a coach is to actually help them learn how to ask questions of themselves. So it's not me necessarily teaching, but I'm teaching via what's called a Greek methodology of asking questions. And that is really the foundation of the wisdom development. It doesn't happen overnight. The reason most people think older people are wise is because they've had more experiences. But the trick is, have they really delved into their experience and looked at it deeply so they understand what's driving that? So they understand all their subjective motivations that are driving what they do. Have they taken a look at stuff that's stored in their unconscious that's really the master tiller of the boat? A lot of people say, well, I'm the master of my ship. I'm going to grab the tiller of life and steer in the direction I want to go. That works real well until you fall asleep, because then the unconscious takes over and steers it back to the direction it's going. So if you can hold the tiller of your ship for 30 to 40 days, then you'll begin to make those changes. But if you just do it for a day, nothing will happen. You'll still continue the same. So the combination of these things become what I call wisdom moments, where you kind of like the aha moments, like, oh, that's how that works. Okay. And you get enough wisdom moments, then you begin the transcendent process. So that's what I'm doing right now.
That's very fascinating. Great. Let us understand, because since you've been doing this since 1985, am I correct?
I've been working on wisdom since probably about 1970, when I first started learning how to meditate and do things like that. I've had an ongoing meditation practice for over 50 years, and that meditation practice is about 2 hours a day. So that's really the thing that caused me to take a look and say, okay, what are all these pieces and how do they fit together, so I have a process. So yeah, if you go back to about 1970, that's when I started doing it. So that's about 52 years ago.
We want to have understanding about a transition for you to become, from a salesperson, because you started as a salesperson, then transcended to, a person that teaching people for wisdom and be transcendent, right? So how did that process all happening? Because why I ask this question is because normally when you spend a long time into a career professions, people tends to, become specialists, become an expert in that area. So you spend years in there, and then you shift your pattern to a new directions and totally new. Why?
This is going to sound strange, but I can only say that Spirit laid that path out for me. And it was my job to follow the path. Now, there's no way I can prove that to you, but there's just enough things that happened in my life that you go, wow, the timing of that was perfect. How did that happen? And so I go back to my meditation practice and I begin to become aware of that. So I had a teacher who I started working with about 1970, a guy named John Roderick. And he's the one who taught me a lot of this. He passed away in 2014, but I would suggest to you that he still works with me in my subconscious. So there's things that continue to appear, and I just go, that's amazing. How did that happen? So that's been kind of the guiding force. And if I look at all the things I've done, it has been preparation for what I'm doing now, where I had to learn this little aspect of myself to be prepared to be able to handle that with other people who have that same thing. Because You can't teach what you don't have experience with.
Mm.
So I have really broad experiences in a lot of different areas, but they all kind of merge together. And the real beginning of understanding wisdom started coming in about 12, 14 years ago.
Mm.
And I'm in the middle of writing a book right now called The Journey to Wise Leadership.
Wow.
It'll probably be about a year before I finish it. It's, let's see. This is a rough draft right now. It's about 500 pages.
Well,
I have to take a buzzsaw to this and cut it down and make it digestible, and so that people can look at it and go, well, that doesn't feel overwhelming. Because if they tried to read this now, they go, forget it.
Great. Allow me to ask this question again, because we all in this world for some reason, and we all has a calling for us to be doing, but not a lot of people had a chance to figure out their calling, so they live, it just as usual, right? So you responded your callings, and then even if you say they were just things just happened for a reason or so. But then was there any sign, anything that happened that Greg knows that, hey, okay, it's a good time to move into the new direction? Can you share that wisdom with us, so that if we ever encounter something similarly, then we would be knowing that, hey, this is time to start respond to some callings that for our own.
This goes back to about when I was about 16 years old.
Mm.
My mother, in today's terms, we would say my mother was very psychic. She had a sixth sense like you wouldn't believe.
Mm.
And we used to refer to her as Swami Mommy. My brother and I could not get into trouble because she would know. Even when I was, graduated from college, I'd get a call every so often. I was living in California. She was living on the East Coast. And she'd say, okay, what's going on? Nothing, Mom. Everything's good. Don't lie to me. So when I was probably 16, she started buying me books on spiritual things, religious things, and giving me books and said, you might find this interesting. And so I started reading these things, and I did find them interesting. So between my sophomore year in high school and when I was a freshman in college, I was looking for more organization to do that. And I read a ton of stuff on ancient mythology, ancient spiritual stuff, going back into the Sufis, going back into Buddha, going back into all of that type of thing, and learning from that. In a way, it was like me trying on different suits of clothes to see what fit and what didn't fit. And I met my teacher when I was a freshman in college. And I had been looking for something like that for quite some time. And so he's the one that guided me. I had just finished my master's degree, and I ran into him at the gas station. We were both filling up our cars. And he said, well, so you finished your master's degree? I said, yes. He said, so you could tell that school to get lost and they couldn't do anything. I said, that's pretty much it. He smiles at me as he's climbing into his car and winks and says, you have to think about getting a doctorate, and then drives off. And I'm sitting there going, damn, well, no. It's on to the next thing. So the next day I was out looking at schools to get my doctorate from.
Wow.
Meantime, I was working full time. I was going to school full time, and I lived in what we refer to as an ashram that had, we had to work out there, so that was about 20 hours a week. So my social life pretty much sucked. That was so the things.
There has to be a trade-off for everything, right? So
you got to decide what you want to do and where you want to go. And that's probably a key thing to wisdom. Not many people really decide that they want to be wise, and there's a reason for that. About 300 years ago, there was a process in Europe that took place also in the United States called the Enlightenment, and it was suddenly shifting from ancient mythology to practical experience. We got to do this, we got to put this, and so the scientific method was baked in. In the process of baking in the scientific method, wisdom was set to the side, and in many cases is lost to people. They don't understand it. So they understand producing results today, getting this done, getting that done, but I'm sure you can agree, you've seen a lot of things happen in various governments where the people are really smart, but the decisions they make are not real wise.
Yep.
So, and I have no allegiance to any political party because I've seen it throughout the entire world, because we've come so far this way. So the pendulum is beginning to swing back the other way. People are going, no, I think we need to do things differently. I think we need to be more in touch with ourselves. And in the United States, there's this thing going on called the Great Resignation, where literally 1 in 5 people is changing jobs and quitting their old company because, for whatever reason, and they sometimes for no reason, they just want to change. But a lot of that has to do with the kind of leadership that's taken place in those companies, which is very scientific, very methodological, and the way we control people is the methodology that we use, and we're trying to eliminate anything that cannot be controlled. Well, I would suggest that people can't really be controlled. They can be forced to do things, but you can't really force their mind to cooperate. And certainly you can't force their emotions to cooperate. I mean, look at the number of rebellions that we've had. So that's part of this sliding back the other way. And so I look at my job as providing a methodology for people that are interested, that want to learn wisdom. It's not an easy thing. You really got to take a hard look at yourself. So it takes a lot of courage to be able to do that. Because looking at yourself and saying, I'm not really doing real well in this area, most people don't want to do. They'll gloss it over and go on to the next thing. So if you're willing to do that, and really willing to take a look at all the aspects of awareness that you have, and how it's impacting you, and how you're making decisions based on that. So if we look at leadership for the last 100 years, at the turn of the last century, a lot of leadership was based on what was called the great man theory. Because most leaders at that time were men, and people thought, well, they were just born to be a leader. They didn't really subscribe to, well, a person can grow to be a leader. And then in the 1910, 1920 area, everything was a transaction. I'll pay you X to do this. And that's when unions got involved, because people weren't really paying X, they were paying something less than X. So that was the transactional period. Then we shifted in the 1950s to what's called the transformational leadership, where it's more charismatic, and leaders are seen to be the kind of people that can motivate people to do things. We're still in the teenage years of what is referred to as transcendent leadership. And I have a book on Amazon about transcendent leadership if you're interested. So that's probably about another 5 to 10 years out before it becomes mainstream. But transcendent leadership, a lot of it comes off of the work that Maslow did. You're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yep.
Okay. A lot of people think self-actualization is his top need. Just before he died, he talked about self-transcendence. And Maslow was not a religious person. He did not believe in God. He didn't deny there was one, but he just didn't choose to believe in it. But it's everything that he wrote about transcendence was that. Now, there's a lot of people that think that Maslow actually developed that about the same time he developed self-actualization. But the American Psychological Association wasn't ready for that. Just like many businesses today are not ready for leaders that lead with their heart and lead with loving, which is a core piece of transcendence. So, people go, loving is for my marriage. It's not for leading people. Well, there's a lot of leaders who have taken up the banner of leading with love that is very different, and their organizations are thriving because People need that all the time, not just at home. They need it in their work environment. And there's a lot of people, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that work longer hours than they are at home.
Yep.
Now, the two of you have a fortunate because you're married with each other, so you get the relationship and the work together at the same time. The president, the CEO of People Savvy is my wife, so we get the same thing. Yeah. So she's been in charge of the company now for almost 15, 18 years. So there's good news to that and bad news to that. Bad news is I have to look at my ego and say, okay, am I encroaching on her turf? So, and then when I get angry with her, I go, okay, I've been projecting my lack on top of you, and I've been angry about that. So I have to with myself and let her know. And she smiled sweetly at me and goes, yeah, I know.
Yeah. Great. Earlier today, you said that the process, everything we start with asking ourselves the questions, right? Regarding to how we do and what we do and things like that, and that sounds very simple, but not a lot of people are doing that, and that's why they're not moving from the knowledge base to the wise base to the transcendence base of just mankind first, not talking about leaders. So why is it so hard for them to asking them the questions that can help them grow?
Because you have to be vulnerable to ask yourself those questions. And most people do not want to show vulnerability,
even to themselves.
Especially in the business environment, because if you show vulnerability, that means people will take advantage of you. So who wants to be taken advantage of? But they don't realize is that perfect vulnerability is also perfect protection. When somebody, here's an example of perfect vulnerability: a baby.
Okay.
Most people would give up their life to protect a baby. So perfect vulnerability, perfect protection. But you've got to get past all of your conditioning, your beliefs, and your negative experiences to move into that. That's not easy to do. It takes somebody who's going to be really willing to do that. So you could talk about wisdom, developing wisdom, and people go, oh yeah, that's a good thing to do. But leave me out of it. So it's not an easy thing to do. You got to really ask yourself these questions. You got to be vulnerable to the questions. You got to be honest with yourself, really authentic. So if somebody, the question is there anything that you feel any doubt about? Oh no, I have no doubts. Really? So, but a person who's on a path to wisdom will say, yeah, I have doubts about this, and this, this, and this, and this. And then the question is how did those doubts appear? What was it that you may not want to acknowledge that you created, promoted, or allowed that created that situation? Then that means you got to take 100% responsibility for the things that are reflected in your life. So one of the spiritual teachings is we attract people to ourselves because that's what we need as our next step. And those people reflect back to you who you are. But what we do most of the time, what human beings do most of the time, is we project our own images out. And some people reflect those images back and some people don't. The people who reflect those images back, they become our friends. But it's still a projection. And the thing that we project in psychology, it's called our shadow side, which is the things that we want to hide from ourselves. But it's okay to see that in another person and make judgments and say it's bad and wrong. We're doing the same thing, but we don't acknowledge that to ourselves because it's in the shadows.
You say that, like a perfect vulnerability requires perfect protections, which means the environment that empower people to show vulnerable and things like that, right? And at home, even Viv and I, and of course our friends also, we try to give the best environment for our loved ones so that they can be show vulnerable, so that they can ask questions and start to to embrace them to the new to the new level. And that sometimes it's hard for us to even given our efforts to doing
Mhm.
so, it's hard for us to help our children to open up and really show their vulnerabilities. So let alone if they go into the modern world and then start to show vulnerabilities, become a lot harder for them. So in your line of works, if we want to create that environment with great protection so that they can be freely to go in and showing themselves and sharing how they feel, what can we do? What should we do?
There's a simple answer to it. It's simple but not easy.
Hmm.
The simple answer is unconditional loving. You
Unconditional.
love them for who they are, what they are, etc. And if you can't do that, there's a baby step.
Hmm.
It's called unconditional positive regard. Can you hold that person in your consciousness or in your head, in your heart, and have nothing but positive thoughts about it? Because as soon as any kind of judgment comes out, it automatically blocks communication.
Hmm.
So people who are very judgmental have a really hard time in the world because a lot of their communication with other people is blocked. So they have a hard time creating relationships, they have a hard time creating friends, they have a hard time in their work environment because who wants to be around a person who's constantly judging them?
Hmm.
Unless, of course, you like that. And there are some people who like that. I tend not to be friends with those kind of people because the reflection of loving is not reflected back to me. So I want unconditional loving around me as much as I can. And there's some people I know that are unwilling to do that, who want to be my friend. And it's like, I'm a little busy right now, but maybe downstream.
Hmm.
And of course, downstream will be when they stop constantly judging me.
Hmm. So we have to
So,
wisely pick the people around us also.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Pick the people that reflect the loving that you give them.
Hmm. But what if we go into the
So,
environment that we have to live with something like that and we're not able to pick? We don't have that privilege to do everything we want to, right? So how can we
yeah,
safeguard ourselves from?
you still have the choice to be loving regardless of what situation, circumstances you're in.
Hmm.
That's always your choice.
Okay.
Okay, so when you go into what I refer to as a very negative environment,
Hmm.
and let's face it, there's some business environments today that still run on transactional leadership or great man theory.
Hmm.
And if you don't bow down to their great man, you're going to catch a lot of crap headed your way.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean you can't be loving to that person. In fact, I would suggest to you that they won't be able to handle it.
Hmm.
Because they'll want to take that loving inside of themselves, but they've got everything locked up. They have all these Gordian knots of consciousness in their head that they haven't learned to cut through.
Hmm.
So that's the thing that blocks them. So remember, you always have a choice of who you are and what you do in the world. Not everybody will be in alignment with that, and that's their choice.
Hmm.
You don't have to force them to be that.
Hmm.
So you put this out, and then suddenly you start attracting people like that, and you go, how did these people show up? Well, he did it
Hmm.
based on who you are inside.
Hmm.
And the more unconditional you make it, which means you give total freedom to people to be however they are.
Hmm.
They may be angry, they may be upset. They have total freedom around you to be that way. They're going to come to you and say, how come when I'm angry and upset, I get around the two of you and suddenly I'm not angry and upset?
Hmm.
You don't have to answer them, but you go, we try to keep a real positive vibe going.
And that takes a lot of strength and courage to do that too.
It takes tremendous strength and courage to do that. It's a simple path, but it's not an easy path.
Mm.
No. I make it sound easy because I've been doing it for 50 years. So,
Greg, I have a question. To be a slowly transcendent, what would a person get to be able to get into that level?
well, I've already given you the key to the door, and that's loving. That's critical to being a transcendent leader. And becoming a transcendent leader means that you develop your wisdom. So the wisdom is the process to becoming a transcendent leader. So we look at our head, which is data, information, and knowledge. Most people stop at knowledge. They're more interested in being perceived as smart. But we know that smartness and wisdom is two different things. So then the next step is hunch, and that's where we develop our intuition. The intuition provides insight into all the things that are going on. So you see things differently. Have you ever drawn what's called a Necker cube, a little stick figure of cube, and you look at it and it shifts? Okay. When you have insight, intuitive insight, you'll find that things in your life shift. It's like, oh, I never noticed that before. When did that show up? And it's like, well, it's always been there. You weren't ready to see it that way. Okay. Sort of like you go into a building, you've been in the building 100 times, and you suddenly notice a picture on the wall. So when did you guys hang that up? About 40 years ago. How come I never noticed it? You just weren't ready to see it at that point in time. And now you are.
Well,
and then the next step is really getting into your heart. So that's empathy, compassion, and then finally loving. So if you read and understand how to be empathic, how to be compassionate, and develop loving, it's great. Some of the best teachings around compassion are Buddhist teachings. And empathy as well. Loving is very generalized. A lot of people have different ideas about what's loving and what's not, but there's a whole level that's unconditional. When you start hitting that unconditional loving, that's when you'll start to transcend in your consciousness. And you begin to see things past the body, imagination, emotion, mind, and unconscious. You start seeing things directly. And that's really who you are, beyond all those other things that we look at as part of our view of the world, they'll say. Because a lot of people don't get past looking at the body. They've got emotions, they've got imagination, they've got mental processes, but they don't pay attention to that. They pay attention to what's going on in the body. Those tend to be transactional leaders because they look at it as a transaction. The transformational leaders have much greater awareness of the other levels of consciousness. Transcendent leaders rise above. So transcend means to rise above. So transcendent leader rises above that. And like the Necker cube that shifts, when you move into transcendent consciousness, things begin to shift. And you look at things from a very different perspective. But wisdom is the path that gets you there.
Wow. Greg, if I want to go into a wisdom and become a wisdom leader, no, let's say a wisdom individual to start with, okay? So, and then I know the process is to ask questions, ask a lot of questions, right, to unveil it. What would be the biggest questions, or a few biggest questions that I need to ask ourselves and our audience need to ask themselves, so that they can start to realize that then there's something that needs to change and transform and transcend?
So probably the first step is to change the kind of questions you ask yourself. So a lot of people ask themselves yes/no questions,
okay,
which are based on right or wrong, good or bad. That doesn't do you any good. So let's say you have an experience. So the first step is really looking at your experiences.
okay.
And then we look at it from cause and effect. But the question is, what caused me to do that? And how is that impacting me and impacting perhaps other people? You just ask those two questions, you become very aware of a lot of different things about yourself. You may be aware of an experience you had when you were a child and your parents scolded you very harshly, and you've carried that all through your life. And you say, so what caused that? Well, I remember my parents getting upset with me. How's that impacting you today? Oh, I got to be right here, right now. Oh, okay. Well, it's kind of an echo. It's one of those things that's in my shadow side. Great. When are you going to drop that so that it's no longer controlling you? So if you have the past controlling you, you'll be in depression. If you have the future controlling you, you'll be in anxiety. If you live right here and right now and just pay attention to everything that's going on right here, right now, you'll live a very harmonious sphere, very harmonious thing. And then anytime you start to have experiences that pull you either way, okay, what caused that? How's that impacting me? How's that impacting other people? So there's no right or wrong here. It's just, what's the cause and effect? And you develop a certain level of neutrality about the past experiences and neutrality about what's going to happen in the future. You know, the fun thing for me is I look at the stock market every day, and there's all kinds of people predicting what the future is going to be. And I can just take a chalkboard and mark up every time their projection is not accurate. And make a statement to myself, boy, I'm glad I didn't invest in that, because I'd be broke now. So I find that just staying present and being present with people and being in that unconditional loving changes everything. It just like it shifts your entire perspective.
Wow.
But it's simple but not easy, but you got to change the questions you're asking yourself.
Wow.
From the right, wrong, good, bad perspective.
Wow.
So what is the cause? What is the effect? How did I create, promote, or allow this thing that's reflecting back to me?
Greg, thanks so much for sharing that. Because Vivian and I had a lot of ambitions, and we had a lot of things that we share in common. And a few days back, we talked about advertising. Okay. And we look at the landscape for, like companies that do advertising for kids, and they always, trying to promote something, a product with the message that the kid will get smarter, we get taller, we have, more successful. And earlier today you said that smart is not the same as wisdom. So if we educate the kids to get into the competitive mode, that they can get smarter, they can get stronger, but if they're not getting wiser, they get into the world, like go into the jungle and keep fighting to become, like a lions, and then dog words like this, it's not gonna be create anything good for them. And if we keep putting that mentality onto a consumer market through advertising, it sounds great, but it's weak from the inside. It's weak from the inside, that is not making anybody grow and not making the community grow in a transcendent way. All right. And I think the conversation that we had tonight is really, really helpful for Vivian and I to see a lot of things in a different perspective, and it give us a lot more strength to continue doing our path. And that lead me to a question that I always fascinated want to know is about thinking. Okay, because we believe that the ability of thinking for human beings actually been not been increasing, but in actually decreasing for a lot of factors, and we wanna help them to get back onto our ability to think and grow in that. So your works has a lot of thinking, and and how can you share with us the secret that you, Greg, are helping you and foster an ability to think and grow your thinking level? Can you share that?
Well, at some point you've got to get past thinking. You have to get past the mind, and that's very difficult because almost everything is geared toward the mind today. I have some very good friends that are psychologists and psychiatrists, but they are very wrapped up in their mind. If you talk to them about their heart, they just shut off. Psychology in the 1930s and 1940s, if you discussed a subjective experience, they would give you a shot of anti-hallucination because subjective experience was just not accepted. When the whole concept of unconditional positive regard came out in the 1950s, it was done as a surrogate to unconditional loving because the psychiatric and psychology departments were not ready for loving. So you look back at the history of wisdom, almost all of the text, regardless of religion, regardless of culture, talks about the heart is the most important part of a person's beingness, not the head. The child of the head is the ego. And so if you're wrapped up in your head, there are four substitutes that you make for loving. Money, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Recognition, being famous. Self-preservation, protecting yourself. And then the last one is romantic ideal. But if you think about ship's captains and airline pilots and that kind of stuff, it's a very romantic kind of living. So people go into choosing what they want to do in the world based on those four things. But they're always a substitute for loving. Now, you're not going to change the world because people have to progress through these things to learn about themselves. Not everybody's ready to move into this. So you'll talk to some people and they'll look at you like you have three heads. I'm used to it by now. Yeah. Some people think I'm absolutely crazy. And maybe they're right. So, but I talk to them and I find out, okay, well, what are you focused on? They said, I got to make money. And advertising is a lot about making money. I need to do it in such a way. So you may not know this, but right after World War II, a lot of the manufacturing processes in the world had been destroyed. The United States hadn't been attacked except Pearl Harbor, so all of our manufacturing processes were working really great. And the economy took off like gangbusters. Then about 1947, 1948, the country started to roll into a recession. The manufacturers went to their advertisers and said, how come our products aren't selling? And they said, because demand has been satiated. And the manufacturer said, excuse us, we pay you to create demand. And so in the 1950s, it was very popular to have psychologists and psychiatrists on the boards of advertising companies to show them how to create demand. So, and there's several books that are written about the process. And again, it gets down to the four things. You know, if somebody hung up about making money, great. Here's the mechanism for getting those people attracted to your product or service. How about becoming famous? And you'll see a lot of people that you interview with will talk about, here's our process for making money, here's our process for making you famous. I remember doing a seminar in Chile, and I was talking about these things. And the person at the break asked me, said, aren't you just doing this to condition us? I said, that's a great question. Why don't you, we'll ask it for the rest of the group. So he asked this question. And I said, have I promised to make you rich? And he goes, no, you haven't. Have I promised to make you famous? No, you haven't. Have I promised that I would protect you? Not that you need it since you're a karate master. No. Have I promised you to find you the love of your life? I said, no. I looked at him and said, I guess not. I'm not trying to do any of these things to you. So I'm just pointing them out as information only. So you'll begin to notice, now that you're aware of this, you begin to notice the people that you interact with, what their major focus is, what their major motivation is. There's nothing good or bad about that. There's nothing right or wrong. It's just that's what they're focused on. But they're all stepping stones to becoming aware, to understanding your experiences, to decoding your experiences, to move into wisdom.
Wow. Great.
It's not a process. It takes short time. Yes.
Well, I thank you a lot for a lot of wisdom that we learned from you today, and I hope that our audience will pick a lot from this conversation so that they can carry home, having a good time of reflection, asking them a lot of good questions that can help them to move to the next stage of wisdom, and I really appreciate the works that you do and admire it, because not a lot of people are also doing that, and then you've been doing that for a very long time, being able to connect all the dots, you know, and helping people to thrive. So that is a very admirable path that you chose, and we wish you all the best so that you can continue carry out the good things for the people around us. And when you complete your book, please let Vivian and I know so that we can be celebrate that together with you. Okay? Don't forget that.
How about if I do something better? How about when I finish the first chapter and get it really clean, I
Okay.
send it to the two of you. But the agreement that you need to make is you have to give me your unvarnished feedback.
Absolutely.
So if you don't think the chapter is any good, you need to tell me that. If you think this piece is good, but this piece isn't good, you need to tell me that.
You have our promise.
Okay.
Yes, and
Let
this is
me
our
leave
very
you with
honor
one-
for us to do that.
We leave you with one additional thought. If you see it in another person, it probably is also inside of you, because you wouldn't see it otherwise. So if some person is doing something that really upsets you, you got to find that piece inside you that has that same thing.
Mm.
And then understanding how you created, promoted, allowed that so that you can begin to release that. Loving really is just allowing all this other stuff that's not loving to fall away. Not something you have to work at. It's something just let go of all this other stuff.
Absolutely.
It's been great talking to the two of you. Thank you very much for reaching out to me.
Thank you very much, Greg. We really appreciate
Thank
that.
you so much.
You have a
And
wonderful
talking to
day.
you give you a lot of peace. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Take care, please. Yeah.